Hi, it's Mrs. Snook. How are you today, guys? So today we're going to continue our discussion of Chapter 4, Section 1, and we're talking about cowboys. And remember, thinking back to everything we've talked about so far in this chapter, we're talking about manifest destiny. And even though that was a concept that was created back in the 1840s, people really and truly believe that it is, you know, ordained by God, that it is part of their destiny, that they can't stop it, that it's meant to happen, that they're supposed to move west and expand out west because there's all sorts of opportunities to get rich quick, potentially through mining, that there's cheap land available so they can, farm their crops, or so they can take care of cattle and sell them because, they want to eat. And there's, opportunities out there. There's a fresh start. There's a whole new life. And some people are going to be trying to forget about their past, and some African Americans are going to be what we call exodusters, trying to escape some of the horrors of racism created by the KKK in the post-Reconstruction South. But we said that people are moving west. And so people who take care of cattle are, of course, cowboys. And no, we're not talking about like Woody from Toy Story. We're talking about actual cowboys. And for the most part, we've said that the life of a cowboy has often been romanticized, especially in magazines and comic strips and TV shows and this whole genre of films called Westerns, where they've made it look like they're always alone on a white horse, wearing white, the outlaw, the bad guy's always wearing black, and that they're working by themselves, they have their loaded gun, the Indians are always attacking, they're going to stop the bad guy from robbing the stagecoach in the bank, and save the girl, and then ride off into the sunset. And of course, that is all myth. It's simply not true. Most cowboys were dirty, bored, somewhat lonely because they were away from their family on a long drive for a long period of time, but they often worked with a team and with a group, and they were not afraid of bank robberies and such, since those were not as common as you think. And their biggest fear was definitely not Native American attacks, but rather stampedes by their cattle. And of course, there is this idea that, of course, the media has made it seem that all cowboys are white, but that is not true. We know that at least a quarter of cowboys were Hispanic, they were Mexican, that they were black, and that is just yet again another myth that was created by the media. And everything that cowboys really know, remember, came from the vaqueros, the Mexican ranch hands who taught them really how to take care of cattle. And we know, remember, that there was this whole rise of this cattle kingdom really goes back to the Civil War. That during the Civil War, men from Texas left, they were fighting, east of the Mississippi River. And we saw during that time period that different breeds of cattle intermixed, and you've got this new breed of the Longhorn, which was very durable, meaning that it was hardy, it wasn't going to just die from any disease, and they could go long distances, they could smell groundwater, and they made it perfect, so that they could go on a long drive. And so Joseph McCoy back in 1867 set up the first real long drive, where he would push his cattle to go about 1,500 miles, about 15 miles a day over the course of 4 to 5 months. And they would travel around a very popular trail called the Chisholm Trail. And they would go from Texas to Kansas to Abilene to one of these railheads or cow towns, a town that had a railroad because the Transcontinental Railroad was first being built. And then the cattle could be shipped back to Chicago for processing, which was a big meat processing plant. And so ultimately, that's when the cowboys would be paid. And it might be that the cattle would only bring, $5 in Texas if they were sold, but if you could get them over to Kansas, where they'd be shipped to Chicago, you might be getting $60 per head. So you're going to be making a lot more money by doing the long drive than compared to selling them and butchering them locally. But when it was all said and done, cowboys would receive a lump sum, but really and truly, it was probably only $1 a day for that long, amount of work that they were doing, because it was scary at night, lonely. You didn't get a lot of sleep. You had to watch your cattle, make sure they didn't, get attacked by animals or wander off. So it could be difficult. And then remember, we said that once they got to the towns, they would kind of be crazy. Most trail bosses, the man who was in charge of the cattle, would not let them stay long because there'd be fighting, there'd be drunkenness, there'd be gambling, they'd spend too much of their money, and they'd go back home. And only a third of cowboys actually chose to sign up to do another long drive. A lot of them disliked it, which is what you're looking at in those primary source documents. There were reasons why they liked it, because there was a sense of family and camaraderie, but other people liked it from the loneliness or the fear or other issues. And The life of the cowboy, remember, this is going to be a short-timed era in American history. We're really for only about 25 years, only about 1865 to 1890 do we see this cattle era. And it really boomed because there was a demand for beef post-war, and because of these longhorn cattle were able to go long distances without water, and also because of the open range, that there was this area where they could just graze freely on the grass and fatten up for a few months before they were butchered and sold. And this cowboy era is an important piece of American history. It's basically happening at the same time as Reconstruction. So even though we tend to study themes in history, one topic together, this is all happening at the same time Reconstruction is happening. So we're going to be seeing that obviously Lincoln has died and Johnson is office during this, and then it's going to be Grant's presidency and then Hayes. They're at the same simultaneous period. But as the cowboy era is going on, it's also going to lead to more westward expansion. More and more railroad tracks will have to be laid to help, basically ship cattle back and forth, and it's going to lead to the development of towns. And so, of course, just like with mining, we're going to see, towns that are booming, like Dodge City and Abilene, where they are boom towns. And once kind of the cowboy era does kind of come to an end, they're not quite ghost towns, but definitely the population will decrease. And here's just some more pictures. This is just like the primary source in document A in the long drive documents that you've seen. And you can see this Chisholm Trail here, okay, the one that I've been talking about, where they're really going from central Texas up to Abilene or to Ellsworth, to Dodge City before they're going to be shipped via the railroad back up to Chicago. But there's other popular trails like the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail, and this Baxter Springs Trail. And of course, some of them do go through Native American territory. That's when you're really going to see the altercations between cowboys and Indians, so to speak, as if they're trying to cross through Indian lands. Of course, as settlers move into Indian lands to try to steal their farmland, as miners come in looking for gold, as they try to build the railroad, that's when we're going to see the conflicts occur because they're trying to take away the land, the property, or trespass on Indian territory. Now, cowboys in general, remember we said that most of them are going to be young men, and of course there is this mentality that they're all white men, but in reality, we know that a quarter of the men are African American. That's what we would refer to as really exodusters, people who are in an exodus. You might have heard that word before if you're like religious and from the Bible, but people who are on a quest, and in this case, people who are trying to escape the Reconstruction South that was, full of racism and hatred post-war, because even though the laws had changed, I'm hoping at this point you realize that the laws may have changed, but they just replaced slavery with these Jim Crow laws, legalizing segregation all the way to the 50s and 60s. And the treatment of African Americans was abominable by most people in the South towards them. So, of course, many people left, and they went on this exodus, and some became, cowboys. And, of course, many Mexicans who had settled from Mexico into Texas taught whites how to really take care of cattle and be ranchers. And, these Mexican vaqueros really were part of this as well, even though the media just often shows images of whites. And it was difficult, of course, to get wealthy. We do see some cattle barons who own a lot of cattle, and they're more on the large corporations, but the average cowboy is not going to get rich, which is why many of them decide by 1900 that, this isn't worth it. We said, remember, only a third of the men re-up for another drive anyway. So by 1900, many of them switch and get factory jobs or turn to farming. Just so you can kind of see the attire of a cowboy, of course, he's going to wear chaps. He's going to wear a bandana to keep dust out of his face, not because he's an outlaw. He's going to wear a wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun out of his eyes. This isn't an era where most Americans are wearing sunglasses. So the hat is going to keep the sun off your face. It's going to help so you don't get burnt. Same thing with the bandana, and of course the chaps to protect from briars and cactus and things like that. And of course, yes, they do have a gun. No, it's not loaded, because if your horse would get spooked, it could potentially go off and shoot someone else or the cattle. So they're not going to be going around with a loaded gun. If they thought they were going into a dangerous situation, they would load it. They would have their bullets right next to them. But they're not going to go around actually with a loaded gun. That's just, yet again, another myth that's been perpetuated over time to make a cowboy perhaps seem more glamorous, as opposed to the stories that they stank and they were bored and it was a difficult, dirty job that they really didn't get the credit they deserved for. Now, eventually, the cattle kingdom is going to come to an end. So just like there were three reasons that led to the cattle kingdom, right? The longhorn cattle, the open range to graze on and fatten them up, and the demand for beef post-war. Eventually, the cattle kingdom is going to come to an end. And the reason it comes to an end is because they were butchering so much beef, because originally there was this demand for steak, and there had been a shortage during the war. And, people thought steak was a status symbol. Well, now you have so much beef butchered that when you have an oversupply of something, the prices drop. If people are desperate to get rid of something, the prices go lower and lower and lower, if you've ever seen a going out of business sale. So that's what happens with beef. And so there's too much of it that's been, raised and slaughtered, and the prices are just dropping. And so ranchers are not making the money that they once did. The other issue is that during the 1870s, they have a terrible winter, and then they have a terrible drought. And so basically, within this blizzard and then a drought, it really doesn't produce great grazing land, which means there's not going to be an abundance, of farmland for the animals that spring and into summer to graze on and to fatten up on the open range as they're heading towards these cow towns, these railheads like Dodge City or Abilene. So that's a real problem. And some of the animals actually didn't survive the winter as well. Some people are also interested in just moving to cities and getting jobs in factories. It wasn't 9 to 5 back then. It was more so 12 to 14-hour days. You'd be lucky if you could find an employer who would hire you for 10. But still, it would be, 7 a.m. to maybe 6 p.m. Was a typical shift. And so, yeah, it sounds like a long day, but at least you get your nights free. And that sounded better than what cowboys had to do, where they had to watch cattle during the night and, change shifts. But the really big thing that led to the end of the cowboy era was barbed wire. Joseph Glidden was an inventor, and he creates barbed wire. And once people start farming or taking their ranches and their farms and surrounding them with barbed wire to make sure that like coyotes or other animals couldn't come in to attack their livestock, it meant the end of the open range. People couldn't just take huge tracts of cattle and fatten them up and graze them from Texas to wherever their destination was to get on the train. And so without an open range, there's no way to really do a long drive. And so that's going to be the main reason. So 3 reasons why the cattle kingdom comes to an end: oversupply of beef, prices drop, bad weather with a blizzard and a drought. Some people think factory life is going to be better, but ultimately it's really barbed wire. Now, last thing to really mention today is that there are so many myths out there about all these famous outlaws of the Wild West. And here's just a couple of them. And if you watch that video clip, it's going to give you a nice overview. But here's 4 right here. This man, this is Billy the Kid. He was a gambler. He was a thief. Supposedly he killed 8 men plus more from being actually in war. He ends up getting put in jail. He escapes jail, and he is hunted down by the sheriff, Pat Garrett, and he is shot in the dark in the back by Pat Garrett. Jesse James is one of the most notorious outlaws of all time. He robs banks, he robs trains, he robs stagecoaches. He's leader of the James Gang. He's eventually killed by one of his own supposed friends, Bob Ford, for the reward money. You can see the poster here. It was very common back then to have reward posters like this. We'll be making our own reward poster here at the end of this unit. And also, of course, there are supposed lawmen, and I put a question mark because these are supposed to be the good guys, the cops, but they also did so many shady things of their own that it's unclear that they were truly on the side of the law. In Tombstone, Arizona, one of those big mining towns that I mentioned, we saw that there were fights between miners over whose land and whose land had the gold and silver on it, but they also fought over cattle ranching and horses. And you've got Wyatt Earp here. He had been a gambler. He'd been in the Civil War. He'd done all sorts of terrible things, supposedly was a lawman and on the good side of the law now. He worked with Doc Holliday, and they're going to get in a shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona against the Clantons. And they end up surviving, but then they're retaliated against, and some of their other buddies here end up getting killed later. He actually ends up then taking revenge on the Clantons and killing them, and then they get out of town before they go to jail. So I say he's a lawman, but is he really? For our purposes, we'll think of him as a sheriff, a lawman. Last but not least is this guy, Wild Bill Hickok. He considers himself to be the fastest gunslinger in the West. He was a sheriff. He'd done all sorts of shady things as well and eventually loses his job. He ends up working with his buddy Buffalo Bill Cody, who had been hired by the U.S. government with the Buffalo Soldiers, many men who were going around purposely killing the buffalo to starve the Native Americans so that they would basically die off, be dependent on farming, be depending on the government for food, but also so that they could build a transcontinental railroad, because you can't have train tracks against the country in case they accidentally hit a buffalo. So he ended up working with his buddy Buffalo Bill Cody, and eventually he was in kind of his gun show. It was basically like a circus act. He was a strange life, and eventually he ends up playing cards. He always liked to sit so that he could see the door, and when he went to go play cards one night, they wouldn't let him sit in his regular seat, and so he ends up facing the door, which he didn't like. And guess what? A man comes up behind him and shoots him and kills him while he was holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights in his hand, which forever in history now has become known as the dead man's hand. So, to wrap up, there's a lot of myths versus reality about the Cowboys. One of the myths is that cowboys were very romantic and self-sufficient and good guys, but in reality, none of that's true. There's nothing really romantic about being a cowboy. They work usually as a team. They're usually pretty young, poorly paid, doing hard labor, and they might be good people, they might not be. I was like, that's just a myth. It's also claimed that they're all white, where in reality, we know that a quarter of them, at least 20%, are black, so 20 to 25%, and Hispanic. And in a particular trail group, we saw pretty harmonious race relations, but in general, Hispanics, blacks in the West were treated with racism just like they were in other parts of the country, but they were perhaps treated better than especially in the South. Yet again, people make it sound like it was fantastic. It was the Garden of Eden. Yeah, right. That you can make a fortune in the West. Yeah, right. As I said, you're making little money. The conditions are harsh. You're making maybe $1 a day, maybe more, which is why some people eventually switched to factory life. There is this myth that Western towns were lawless and there are all these shootouts and stagecoach robberies and Native American attacks. Yeah, there are some Native American attacks. There are a few stagecoach and bank robberies, but not many, and it's not as lawless as you think because there are these vigilance committees. But all these sheriffs, are kind of questionable, like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. But they did have somewhat police forces and order in the West. And of course, the other myth is that Native Americans are always attacking and cowboys carry a loaded gun. And yet again, that's not true. Native Americans don't usually attack unless they've been provoked. They try to keep to themselves. And ultimately, no, you would not carry a loaded gun in case it went off. All right, guys, have a great day. That's it for now.